Thank you. So I'm going to be presenting a high-level overview of a literature review that we did for an ongoing project. And the co-authors on this literature review were Suzanne Stevenson, Chris Johnson, and Tracy McKay. And Suzanne at the time was working for us at FR Research, but now she's working with Chris Johnson at UNBC on her master's. But she was the driving force behind a lot of this research, a lot of the lit review. So I'm going to give her credit where credit is due. My name is, as you said, my name is Laura. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm speaking to you today from Hinton, Alberta, which is Treaty 6 territory and the homelands of the Assiniboine, Cree, Métis, Blues, Stoney, and Tsuut'ina peoples. So we know that caribou prefer large areas of intact forest and that they generally avoid habitat disturbance. And we know that increasing disturbance in caribou ranges from forestry and from oil and gas has increased predation risk for caribou, which is the proximate cause of caribou declines, but it all links back to habitat disturbance. But we know that wildfire is a natural part of the boreal ecosystem. So what is it about natural disturbances like wildfires versus human disturbances like harvesting that results in such different responses by caribou? And of course, we know from a lot of research that's already published that a large part of the difference is because of the extent of human-caused disturbance versus natural disturbance on the landscape, as well as the spatial configuration. Just the sheer footprint of one versus the other in the landscape. But there's also differences at finer scales. And these differences between stands that are regeneration after wildfires versus stands that are regeneration after harvest. And these are differences that could perhaps be reduced with new forest practices to make harvesting, to mitigate some of the impacts of harvesting on caribou moving forward. This is one of the, as Christy said, this is one of the research gaps that the ARCKP identified, and it came about as part of a workshop that was held a few years ago. I can't remember the year because I'm still stuck in March 2020. But this workshop identified, brought researchers together, and then identified some of these research gaps and opportunities moving forward for caribou conservation, for caribou research in Alberta. The opportunity to perhaps apply silviculture and forest practices to benefit caribou. And of course, the potential role of silviculture in caribou conservation isn't a completely new topic. There has been research already carried out. So just draw a few examples here. Of course, there's many more, but the Highway 40 lichen trials, any of you driving up Highway 40, you can see them on the western side of the road. These were established back in the 1990s, and there was Dale Vitt ran that project, and Rebecca Linehan was a PhD student on it about a decade later. And then we actually, at the FR Research Caribou Program, worked with Dale to look at the impacts of that canopy thinning on lichens just in 2017 to 2019. There's a study that was published in 2016 from Quebec, which looked at the different forest practices that are implemented in that province and how those impacted understory, specifically with a link to caribou conservation. In 2018, Jake Bradshaw and Chris Johnson started a project at UNBC looking at the different forestry practices implemented in British Columbia and how those link back to wildlife community dynamics, with again a specific link to caribou. And then our own group at FR Research, we started a project also in 2018, and that project was focused on silviculture and specifically the impact of silviculture on use of harvest blocks by primary prey, so moose, deer, and elk, and also their predators. So we're hoping to have papers out from that soon. But if you want to learn more about that project, Tracy McKay gave a webinar about it a few weeks ago as part of the ADMI Caribou Monitoring Unit webinar series. So the link for that is up on the screen, but it's quite easy to find if you just go to the CMU website. The goal of the project identified by the ARCKP was focused on silviculture from a caribou perspective. So kind of building on the work that other people have done, kind of looking at primary prey perspective. So focused on that, on silviculture from a caribou perspective and also from an Alberta perspective. And these are the specific objectives identified in the RFP for the project. So it's to look at differences between harvested and burned stands, and also stands that caribou use. So kind of trying to figure out where those are different from one another and what could be done on the landscape to make them less different from one another and maybe make habitat better for caribou in a shorter time scale. So the project will combine that information, so knowledge from collected from harvested stands, burned stands, and stands caribou use, and use that to inform future forest management in caribou population ranges. And as you've heard already, the first step in this talk was, or the first step in this project was to do the literature review to inform the field data collection. And that's what I'm going to be primarily speaking about today. And the literature review is a brief summary of the knowledge about how boreal and mountain caribou and food that they eat respond to fires and forestry. And I say brief because it is brief. The scope of the project limited us to 15 pages, which anyone familiar with the caribou literature will know that it's really not enough space to completely summarize all the literature out there, but we think we did a good idea drawing on the main take-home messages from a large amount of the research out there. The literature review is also limited to Western science knowledge, and we recognize that there's a considerable amount of traditional knowledge also on this subject. So the literature review is divided into 4 main sections, and these are the way that this presentation is divided up. So we had habitat selection, distribution, so where caribou are on the landscape, movement, so travel across the landscape, demography, so mortality and recruitment, and then forage, focused on terrestrial and arboreal lichens. So I'm going to, the talk's going to be structured. I'm going to go through each of these 4 kind of buckets in turn, and within each of them, I'm going to briefly describe how caribou respond, how, for example, caribou habitats and selection is changed or by fires, and then forestry. So kind of each in turn, but kind of fires first and forestry second for each of these sections. Okay, so first starting off with fires. We know that caribou generally avoid areas that have been burned for about 60 up. It can be for up to 60 years after burning. But there are differences amongst seasons and amongst different regions. So, for example, in northeastern BC, a study found that caribou actually selected, and they used these areas that had been previously burned in all seasons. In contrast, in Alberta, a study that came out this year found that caribou avoided burns and residuals within burned areas in all seasons. And just showing the graph from this paper, here you've got caribou, the percent of caribou that either avoided, selected, or neither avoided or selected, so they were neutral, to residuals in fires and also fires. And I just want you to notice that kind of dominance of that black bar, which is avoidance. So you can see in the 4 seasons within this study that caribou predominantly were avoiding wildfires. In Saskatchewan, slightly similar pattern to Alberta, although they did find that during the calving season, caribou actually selected previously burned areas. And the authors suggested this is because young fires might provide valuable habitat for caribou during the calving season when they're lactating and need to kind of meet these high energetic requirements. So it could be that the early cereal vegetation in those young burns are preferred for that reason during that season. And then in the Yukon, there was a lot of it. This study was just focused in the 2 winter seasons, so early winter and late winter. But again, a pattern of caribou avoiding fires, although there was a little bit more variation later on in the winter. And caribou use of fires did increase as fires got older. which is kind of what we'd expect. Okay, so that was a very brief overview of kind of the variation across different areas in Canada from the studies that have focused on caribou response to fires. So kind of bringing that all together, they tend to avoid burned habitat 60 to 60 years after burning, even when there is terrestrial forage available. So it's not just about the availability of food, there's other factors that are determining caribou response. Caribou, this variable response across the country that has been reported just from these different studies could be linked to the availability of vascular forage, caribou balancing that against predation risk, and then also the different energetic requirements they have at different times of the year, and if they have a calf with them or not. So, for example, vascular plants are available in younger burns during the growing season, and fires have improved visibility, so they could have caribou could be less predation risk in areas that have been burned. But equally, vascular plants are going to attract primary prey, which in turn will attract predators. So there are a number of different factors that caribou kind of have to balance against one another and trade off against one another in their response to wildfires at these scales. When it comes to harvest, similar to wildfires, caribou also avoid harvested areas. Research has also found that harvesting can shift or change home range sizes, and harvesting can change movement within home ranges. So this is a figure from a paper that ARCKP published back in 2016, and it was looking at caribou home ranges over time in relation to habitat disturbance, so primarily forest harvesting within this area over time. And what we found was within annual ranges, caribou home ranges were shifting so that even though there was an increase in disturbance within their annual ranges, the overlap between where caribou were and disturbance remained constant. So they were shifting where they were in the landscape so that even though the disturbance in the landscape was increasing, their exposure to that disturbance was staying constant. And Williams et al. In 2021 expanded on this research, looking at the migratory behavior of these two caribou populations and showing that the shift in home ranges also corresponded to a loss of migratory behavior. How harvesting occurs on the landscape can also impact caribou response. So, for example, a study in Quebec found that in areas where there was older forest adjacent to very young clear cuts, the caribou did use these young clear cuts, which of course could be problematic because these young harvested areas are areas that primary prey like to use and also predators. So that spatial configuration of harvesting is also having also impacts how caribou respond to harvesting. Response, similar to wildfires, response can vary by the reproductive status of caribou. So another study from Quebec found that females with calves actually selected younger blocks. So this is from the Gaspésie Peninsula in Quebec. So females with calves with them selected these younger blocks, and the authors suggested this is because caribou are trading off these different factors that they have to across the year and whether or not they have calves with them. So in this case, they're trading off minimizing predation risk from wolves against being able to access early zero vegetation in cut blocks, not even though that may also expose them to increased predation risk from bears who also like those cut blocks. So in these multi-predator systems, caribou have to make trade-off and choices in predation risk from exposing themselves to one predator versus another, which can drive variable responses to disturbance. So in this system, it's not grizzly bears, even though it's a lovely picture of a grizzly bear we got from our trail cameras, but it's wolves and black bears. But then if you think about further west, particularly around where I am right now, there's even more predators that caribou need to balance predation risk between. So we've got black bears, grizzly bears, cougars, and wolves. So quite complex decisions that caribou have to make on the landscape. I don't envy them. In managed landscapes, research has found that connectivity amongst protected blocks is important. So again, kind of linking back to that spatial configuration I already touched upon, but yeah, maintaining connectivity amongst blocks is important for caribou because as caribou move between these protected blocks, they are exposed to increased predation risk. And there has been research published from British Columbia that has demonstrated this. Okay, so that was a very, very quick overview of the response of caribou to wildfires and harvest relative to habitat selection and home ranges. When it comes to movement, wildfires, initially, they might not have a huge impact on movement, but over time, as those down trees begin to fall down, and that can begin to restrict movement of caribou and also field technicians. These are some photos our field techs took from some fire sites we sampled a few years ago. So you can see that that wouldn't be fun to move through. And then if you think about having snow on top of that and not being able to see those to navigate, yeah, I wouldn't like to walk through that when it's covered in snow. And snow is also a factor when it comes to movement because the lower canopy cover that happens after wildfires will impact snow accumulation on the ground, will impact how quickly it melts in the spring, will impact how much it hardens over the winter. So this is just showing that this is the same fire shown from the air and from the ground. And you can see here that there'll probably be quite a lot of snow accumulating on the ground in that area because there's virtually no canopy cover to intercept it. Although we know that caribou are really good at moving through snow, deep snow can restrict their movement and increase their energy expenditure during the winter, although at deeper snow depths than other ungulates and predators, and we know that from all the excellent work that Ed Telfer did back in the day. And we know that snow accumulation on the ground is also going to access how easily caribou can forage. So when they're cratering for terrestrial lichens, if the snow is very deep, that's going to require more energy to access the terrestrial lichens. If the snow is frozen on top, that's also going to increase energy expenditure. And snow depth and hardness is also going to impact how caribou can access arboreal lichens as well. So when it comes to movement, we know that harvest blocks and the roads associated with harvesting are barriers to caribou movement. So yeah, there's been, I've just shown some forced citations here at the bottom and just demonstrating that. So they are barriers to movement. They kind of disconnect the landscape for caribou. Similar to wildfires, the canopy cover reduction after harvesting is going to impact snow and access to forage. Although this, of course, will be, particularly when it comes to clear-cut harvesting, this is going to be quite a bit more extensive than it might be in a wildfire that might not completely have lost its canopy, or at least have some trees there to intercept snowfall during the winter. Okay, and we're on to our third section. So demography and how that is impacted by wildfire. So when it comes to mortality, studies have found that burned areas don't predict caribou mortality rates. Now my slide isn't advancing. Using habitat that has been burned doesn't increase mortality risk for caribou. But it's possible that wildfires contribute to mortality risk at coarser scales that has been evaluated to date. And so we know from research that we've done in the Caribou program that mortality risk is impacted by the habitat that the caribou uses before they die, so 7 to 14 days before they die, as well as where they die. So perhaps looking at mortality risk and wildfires at kind of that wider temporal scale might provide more links because it's not only where the caribou dies, but also where it encounters the predator. And then we also know that burned areas provide early cereal habitat preferred by primary prey, which Although this will vary with wildfire age, severity, and area, this is going to link to increased densities and distribution of predators, increased predation risk for caribou. So although there haven't been studies to date haven't detected direct links between caribou mortalities and wildfires, it's likely that the impact of wildfires on caribou is synergistic with those of other disturbances which create early zero-stage habitat and predator travel routes within caribou ranges. When it comes to recruitment, wildfires account for 5% of the calf recruitment rate in boreal caribou populations across Canada. Recruitment can be, it doesn't reduce immediately after wildfires, but it will reduce over time. And it's possible the recruitment, caribou recruitment is more resilient to natural disturbances like wildfires in comparison to anthropogenic disturbance. And when there's a lot of fire on the landscape, but there isn't other disturbances, it could be it's possible that caribou recruitment could be more resilient to wildfires. Okay, so the impacts of harvesting on demography. We know from research that anthropogenic disturbance, which includes harvesting, does predict caribou mortality rates. We know that predation is more likely to occur in areas with more harvesting and more young forest. And we know that forestry access roads, so we know that linear features are used by predators of caribou for movement. So these include roads, pipelines, seismic lines, and linear features increase predation risk for caribou. When it comes to recruitment, again, the studies from using all the data from across Canada found that anthropogenic disturbance, including harvest, is 65% of calf, accounts for 65% of calf recruitment rate. We know that survival of caribou decreases as the percent of young forest in caribou ranges increases. But we also know there can be a lag in impact of harvesting on caribou from 5 to 20 years. So it's not always immediate, and there can be a little bit of a delay over time. So the final section in the literature review is focused on forage, and predominantly focused on terrestrial and arboreal lichens, as I said. So we know that lichens are a dominant food source for caribou, particularly during the winter months. When it comes to the impacts of wildfires on lichens, so what immediately after a fire comes through, of course, depending on the intensity, but generally lichens will be burned up in the fire, and early zero-stage vegetation will dominate the understory until about 40 years after the wildfire. And then, depending on local habitat conditions and ecosites, lichens will be the dominant understory will be dominant in the understory until feather mosses replace them, and that can be from 70 to 300 years after burning, so quite a bit of variation in timescales. When it comes to arboreal lichens, those can recover between 60 and 100 years after burning. This time frame will, of course, depend on whether or not all the trees were completely burned during the fire, or some trees, or if it was a less high intensity wildfire, where some trees survived. But there is a huge amount of variation in how this successional pathway progresses and the players within the successional pathway, and depending on local ecosite conditions. And there's so much research out there, amazing research from the University of Alberta and many other places looking at the succession relative to wildfires and harvesting. I'm just going to very briefly touch on some examples here, but as I said, it's going to be scratching the surface. So just for example, a study from Alberta found that terrestrial lichens were dominant within the understory 20 to 50 years after burning, and then they decreased once the stand reached over 70 years of age. A study from Ontario found it was a little bit younger stand age when terrestrial lichens began to be the dominant understory vegetation, or not vegetation, but you know what I mean. And in BC, in the central interior, again, just showing some of this variation. So 50 to 150 years after burning is when terrestrial lichens are dominant, but I'm just grouping all terrestrial lichens together here. There is different species at different parts in the successional pathway as well. And in Northwest BC, Chachowski and Banner found that terrestrial lichens in their particular study areas were dominant until about 200 years after burning. So you can see just from these 4 examples, huge amount of variation depending on the local conditions in the forest stand and how these successional pathways progress. And in particular, in really dry sites, terrestrial lichens can actually be the main understory cover quite early on, from 10 to 300 years. So these sites aren't really good habitat for other early zero stage vegetation, other green plants that like a little bit more moisture. And so in those type of sites, then terrestrial lichens can dominate for a much longer time period. I touched on this briefly. Intensity of wildfires is going to have an impact as well on terrestrial lichen cover and arboreal lichen cover. And lichens can be resilient to low intensity wildfires. Yeah, they can be resilient to low intensity wildfires, and arboreal lichens can also be a little bit resilient, but wildfires can decrease the availability of arboreal lichens closer to the ground, depending on how quick and how fast it burns through a forest stand. And we also know, as I focused here on terrestrial lichens, but we also know that early zero vegetation created by fires is used by caribou during the growing season, but it's also attracted to primary prey, which links back to predation risk for caribou as well. So when it comes to forage in harvesting areas, it's a little bit different. So depending on how the stand is harvested, lichens can actually remain in the stand 2 to 5 years after harvesting. And after that, the more open canopy is going to impact the availability of lichens on the ground. So after that, then you get vascular plants, and then lichens begin to return, and harvested stands can be similar to fire origin stands 30 to 100 years after harvest. So again, a huge amount of variation depending on local habitat conditions. So again, just some quick examples. So here, a study from Quebec showed that harvest and fire origin stands were similar to each other 5 to 13 years after burning. A study from Ontario found that terrestrial lichens were available in their particular sites that they sampled, regardless of age, and there's terrestrial lichens in about 30% of the stands. We also know that how that stand is harvesting is going to impact lichens. So if you think about damaging lichens, if you do winter harvest on snow, that has less of an impact on terrestrial lichens, and that's when those lichens will remain in those harvested stands for a few years after harvesting, at least until the light microclimate conditions promote growth of vascular plants. Scarification, so a lot of ground disturbance, site preparation, mechanical site preparation, and also application of harvesting can decrease the availability of terrestrial lichens on the ground. So that may result in there not being that initial availability of lichens after harvesting. And herbicide can decrease the availability of lichens in slightly older stands too. And we also know from studies from Alberta and elsewhere that partial removal of the canopy can actually help to maintain terrestrial arboreal lichens, but the jury's still out on how that impacts predation risk for caribou, how primary prey respond to those partial canopy removals. Some preliminary analysis from BC found that primary prey actually also might prefer those same stands. So we need a bit more research to determine the implications of partial harvesting and thinning on caribou from not only a forage perspective, but also from a primary prey and predation risk perspective. Okay, so that was a very quick overview of a huge amount of literature on a huge topic. So I'm just going to briefly summarize what we found from these different sections in the lit review. So when it comes to habitat selection, distribution, and movement, wildfires are generally avoided by caribou, but there is some variation. There doesn't seem to be a huge impact on home ranges impact of wildfires and home ranges. And the open canopy after burning is going to impact movement and also access to forage during the winter. Similarly, harvested stands are avoided by caribou, more consistent avoidance across different published studies. There is an impact of harvesting on home ranges of caribou, so they can shift or abandon home ranges after foresting. And we know that roads and connectivity between blocks is important, depending on what habitat caribou have to travel through when they're moving between protected blocks. They can be exposed to increased predation risk. And similar to wildfires, the open canopy is going to impact snow cover on the ground and access to forage. For demography, no direct links between wildfires and mortality, and wildfires account for 5% of recruitment. When it comes to harvesting, there are links between roads and predation risk and mortality risk for caribou. We know that survival will decreases with the amount of percent of early serial habitat in caribou ranges, and harvesting or anthropogenic disturbance, including harvesting, accounts for 65% of the recruitment of boreal caribou populations. And when it comes to forage, huge amount of variation in when terrestrial and arboreal, terrestrial lichens in particular, are available after wildfires. 40 to 70 years in general. Boreal lichens are about 100 years, but there's a lot of variation based on local habitat conditions and also the intensity of the wildfire. Forage, depending on how the stand is harvested, terrestrial lichens can remain for a few years after harvesting, after which they decrease. Then you get vascular plants, with terrestrial lichens returning 40 to 70 years after harvesting. And similar to burn stands, the boreal lichens are available around 60 to 100 years after harvesting. Again, a huge amount of variation amongst ecosites and areas. And silviculture can have positive or negative impacts on forage. So positive relative to canopy thinning, selective harvesting, or negative relative to the application of herbicides or scarification. So the goal of this lit review was to inform our field data collection, and this variation amongst ecosites and areas, variation with silviculture, and variation with intensity of wildfires. We noticed this variation looking at these different studies, and so we wanted to account for this in how we collected the data. So if we link back to the original objectives of the project, what we did for objective 2 was we wanted to make sure that we sampled across different silviculture practices, burn intensities, ages, and ecosites across Alberta. So there has, of course, been a lot of data collection on differences between fires and harvested areas already carried out in Alberta and elsewhere, but those studies are generally localized to one part of the province or one caribou population range. So this study, what we decided to do was to try and account for this variation in ecosites, natural subregions across different caribou populations across Alberta, and also trying to account for silviculture and burn intensity as well. So trying to figure out what is causing these differences between harvested stands and burn stands in different parts of the province. So that's what we did for our field data collection. We decided to stratify our data collection in fires by subregion, ecosite, age, and burn intensity. For harvested areas, we stratified by subregion, ecosite, and age. And for stands that caribou use, we're stratifying by subregion and ecosite. We also, of course, want to include silviculture, but that's going to be included in the data analysis stage. There was just too many potential silviculture strata to include when it came to the data collection part of the project. So that's going to be included in the next part in the data analysis. And in these different sampling strata, we set up a 100-meter squared sampling plot, and within that plot, we collected information on forest stand characteristics, lateral cover, percent cover of different understory, vascular plants, lichens, and we also recorded soil structure and canopy cover. And as I said, we wanted to sample these strata across all the caribou population ranges across the province of Alberta. So to capture all of that at the same time and have a study where we could compare amongst these different strata rather than trying to compare different studies carried out with different methods in different areas. So we had an amazing crew this last summer who were very tolerant of our COVID protocols. You can see we did our training, doing all the masking, etc. And once that was set up, the crews formed a COVID bubble, at least until midway through the season when rules for COVID changed. But yeah, we had three teams of 2 living in trailers and going around the province and sampling in the three different regions that we focused our sampling for this project. So that was the Northeast, West Central, and Northwest. So those kind of, when we looked at the natural subregions and how this overlapped with caribou population ranges, those were the natural divisions that came up with our sampling strata. So this past summer, those amazing 6 individuals collected data from 307 sites, and this is just showing the breakdown of those sites by age and also by natural subregion. So a little bit uneven right now, but it was only our first year of data collection, so we'll even that out next summer. And then just zooming in on the different areas we sampled. So a red circle means it was a fire strata, and an orange circle is a cut block strata. As you can see in the Northeast, at least this year, we sampled more fire strata than harvest strata. West Central, we sampled more harvest strata than fire strata. In West Central, a lot of the fires are helicopter access, so that'll probably be something to have a fun field season next year, sampling those sites. And up in Northwest, in Chinchaga, kind of an even distribution of fire strata and cut block strata. So breaking it down, so we sampled 180 fire sites this summer, and 127 harvested sites. We didn't sample any stands that caribou used. We're going to be sampling those next summer when we're going to have, hopefully, no COVID, and we will have 5 field crews. This year we had 3. Ultimately, the anticipated outcomes of this project are to provide fine-scale information on differences between wildfires and harvested areas and stands caribou use, also information on fibre volumes and stand structure and stands caribou use. And we'll have a postdoc at UNBC who's going to integrate all the field data collection, build all the models, build GIS tools, and ultimately have a way for partners in the fire sector to determine how future silviculture practices might change the trajectory of harvested stands to make them more or less like areas that are burned, and combine the information in this project we hope will help to inform future forest practices in Alberta and caribou population ranges. So with that, I just want to thank the Caribou Program team at FR Research. So Leonie Brown, Cam McClellan, and Tracy McKay are the biologists working on the program, and I want to particular shout out to Leonie and Cam, who did all of the field data collection management this summer, all the management of the crews, all the COVID protocols, etc., and the field work. We had an amazing field team. If you want to know more about the project, there's the web address for the project. The crews did some great blog posts over the summer. They seem to have a lot of fun as well as collecting some excellent data for us. And this is a 45-minute webinar. The lit review has a lot more information in it. So if you want to dig deeper into that, then that's the web address for the lit review. Thanks.